The neon sign of the Velvet Hour buzzed, a persistent electric hummingbird in the crisp autumn night. For Emily Carter, crossing its threshold was an act of surrender. Inside, the world softened into a haze of low light, the clink of glass, and a murmur of conversations that asked no questions of her. It was her refuge, 2, maybe 3 nights a week, ever since the silence in her sprawling suburban house had grown too loud to bear. Her marriage to David, a high-flying corporate lawyer, wasn't a battlefield, it was a museum. A beautifully curated, exquisitely quiet museum dedicated to the image of a perfect life. Their conversations were logistical memos, the gardener's schedule, the charity gala next month, his upcoming trip to Chicago. The warmth she once felt for him had cooled into a polite, distant courtesy. They were roommates with a shared mortgage and a fading photo album. Infidelity, in the classic sense, had never crossed her mind. It seemed too loud, too messy, too real for the pristine emptiness of her world. Her sin was simpler, sadder, loneliness. And in that loneliness, the Velvet Hour became her chapel. And the bartender, Leo, was its quiet priest. Leo was a study in calm contrast to the bar's dark energy. In his mid-30s, with thoughtful brown eyes that missed nothing and hands that moved with a sure, efficient grace, he was a fixture. He was friendly to all but familiar with few. He listened to the regulars' woes with a patient nod, offering neither empty platitudes nor unsolicited advice, just the small sacrament of a perfectly made drink. Emily's first night, a year ago, she'd perched on a corner stool, flustered after a pointless argument with David about the new patio furniture. "What can I get you?" Leo had asked, his voice a low, steady baritone. "A gin and tonic, please," she'd said, her voice tight. He'd made it without comment, but as he placed the crystal glass before her, he'd met her eyes. Rough night. That simple acknowledgement, the permission in his question, had unexpectedly unspoiled something in her. She hadn't cried, but she'd talked. Just a little. About the pressure, the quiet, the feeling of being a supporting actress in her own life. He'd listened, wiping the bar in slow circles, his attention a tangible thing. When she left, he'd simply said, "See you next time, Emily." He'd remembered her name. It was his job, she told herself, but it felt like a gift. The next week, she returned. Before she could even slide onto the stool, he was already reaching for the premium gin, the fresh lime, the specific brand of tonic she'd mentioned she liked. He set it down with a small, barely there smile. "1 gin and tonic. How's the patio situation?" She'd laughed, a real laugh that startled her. "It's a patio." And so it began. A ritual. She'd arrive, often still wearing the elegant, armor-like dresses her social life required, and he would have her drink waiting. He remembered everything. That she hated too much ice. That she'd had a headache last time and might prefer a soda water tonight. That her mother was visiting and she needed the fortification. Their talks deepened, weaving through the quiet hours between rushes. She learned he was a freelance graphic designer who bartended for the human connection, for the stories. He was saving to start his own small studio. He loved old movie posters and thought the best philosophy was found in blues lyrics. He asked questions David hadn't asked in years. What did you dream of being when you were little? What's a book that changed you? He listened to her answers as if they were blueprints to a treasure map. The connection was an emotional lifeline, a secret garden of understanding. She told herself it was innocent. He was just the bartender, a friendly face, a good listener. But her heart began to sink its beats to her visits to the Velvet Hour. She'd think of a clever thing to tell him while choosing David's tie. She'd feel a flutter of anticipation driving to the bar that she never felt driving home. The line between gratitude and something more began to blur on a rainy Tuesday. David was in Chicago again. The house was a tomb. She went to the bar, soaked and shivering. Leo took one look at her and said, "The usual won't cut it tonight." He turned and made something else, a hot toddy, honey, lemon, bourbon, a cinnamon stick. He placed it before her, his fingers briefly brushing hers. "This is for when the weather outside and the weather inside match." She wrapped her hands around the warm mug, tears mingling with the rain on her cheeks. "He doesn't see me, Leo. I'm a piece of his scenery. You see me. You remember my drink." His usual composure faltered. He leaned on the bar, closer. "It's not hard to see you, Emily. You're the most vivid person in this room." The air between them crackled. It was the first time the unspoken was almost spoken. She left that night with his words ringing in her ears, a hotter, more intoxicating brew than any drink. The true inflection point came on the night of her wedding anniversary. David had forgotten. Truly, completely forgotten. Buried in a merger. He'd texted at 8 p.m., swamped. "Order in." Back late. Sitting in her formal dining room, staring at the cold meal she'd prepared, Emily felt something break, not with sadness, but with a clear, cold finality. She didn't change out of her elegant emerald green dress. She drove to the Velvet Hour, a woman on a mission she couldn't yet name. Leo was there. The bar was slow. He looked up as she entered, and his eyes widened slightly at her attire, her fierce expression. He didn't ask. He simply began making her gin and tonic. When he set it down, she didn't touch it. He forgot, she said, her voice quiet and steel. 7 years. He forgot. Leo's expression shifted from professional concern to something raw, pained. Emily, do you know what he got me for our anniversary last year? She continued. The dam breaking. A new coffee maker. Because ours was inefficient. Not even a card. Just an appliance. You remembered the first time I walked in here that I prefer lime, not lemon. You remember that, Emily, he said again, coming around the bar. He didn't stop this time. He stood before her, close enough for her to smell the clean scent of soap and lime on his skin. You deserve so much more than a coffee maker. You deserve poems. You deserve someone who remembers everything, not because it's their job, but because they can't forget. She looked up at him, the last of her resistance crumbling. What are we doing, Leo? I don't know, he whispered, his hand coming up to gently trace the line of her jaw, a touch so electric it felt like the first touch she'd ever known. But I know I think about you when you're not here. I know I save the corner stool. I know your laugh is my favorite sound in this whole place. It was the confession they'd both been circling for months. And in that moment, the emotional infidelity crystallized into a desperate, physical longing. The attraction, the deep emotional bond, the neglect at home, it fused into a single, irreversible choice. She leaned in. He met her halfway. The kiss was not a gentle, exploratory thing. It was a dam breaking, a silent scream given form. It tasted of gin and lime and longing, and for Emily, it felt like waking up from a long, cold sleep. It was wrong. She knew it was wrong with every fiber of her moral being. But in that heartbeat against his, in the way his arms held her as if she were precious and essential, it felt more right than anything had in years. They broke apart, breathing heavily, foreheads touching. The real world came crashing back. The empty bar, the CCTV camera in the corner, the wedding band on her finger that felt like a searing brand. I can't, she started, panic rising. I know, he finished, his eyes full of a tumultuous mix of joy and anguish. You should go. She fled. The drive home was a blur of tears and trembling hands. David was still not home. The silent museum of her house seemed to mock her. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. The emotional connection had been a secret garden. Now it was a forbidden city, and she had stepped inside. The following days were agony. Guilt was a constant, gnawing companion. She avoided the Velvet Hour, terrified of facing Leo, terrified of her own feelings. David, oblivious, continued his distracted life. His lack of awareness, once a source of sadness, was now a source of furious resentment. How could he not see the earthquake that had shattered his wife? After a week of silent torment, she knew she had to see Leo. Not to continue the affair, but to find some semblance of closure, to apologize, to understand what it all meant. She went on a Sunday afternoon, when she knew he'd be working a quiet shift. He was polishing glasses, and when he saw her, he froze. The easy warmth was gone, replaced by a tense, hopeful sorrow. Emily, we need to talk, she said, her voice small. He came around the bar, but kept a careful distance. I know. I've been thinking of nothing else. I'm married, she said, the statement feeling absurdly inadequate. I know, he repeated, and I would never ask you to. I'm not that guy. But what I said, what I feel, it's real. It doesn't excuse what we did, but it explains it. What do we do? She asked, the question hanging in the dusty afternoon light. You have a choice, he said gently. A real one now. You can go back to your museum, Emily. You can live with the quiet. Or you can choose a life where someone sees you, every day. Where you're not a convenience, but a necessity. He wasn't pressuring her. He was simply naming the two paths that had always been there, now illuminated by the painful, glorious truth of that kiss. She didn't answer him that day. She went home and looked at her life with new, devastating clarity. She looked at David, really looked at him, as he scrolled through his phone during dinner. She thought of Leo, remembering the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her abandoned painting hobby. The decision, when it came, was not made in passion, but in a profound, quiet certainty. It was not about running to Leo, not entirely. It was about running away from a life of emotional death. She asked David for a divorce. The confrontation was as cold and procedural as their marriage had been. He was shocked, then angry, then finally, dismissive. He accused her of being dramatic, of having a midlife crisis. He never once asked her why. He never truly saw her, even at the end. The divorce was swift and clinical, like a business transaction dissolving. She moved into a small apartment, the first place that was wholly hers. She started painting again. The world was terrifying and vast, but it was alive. She gave herself time, months, to heal, to be alone, to ensure she wasn't just rebounding. Leo respected that space. He was a constant, patient presence, a text message, a funny meme, a thinking of you that never asked for anything. Finally, on a spring evening, with the scent of blossoms in the air, she walked into the velvet hour. He was behind the bar. He looked up, and his whole face transformed. She didn't take the stool. She walked to the end of the bar. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he breathed. "I'm not here for a drink," she said, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips for the first time in what felt like forever. Leo didn't smile back immediately. He looked at her, really looked, his eyes searching hers. Then, slowly, he untied his apron, folded it neatly on the bar, and came around to her. He took her hands in his. "Good," he said softly, "because I'm not here to be your bartender." The story doesn't end with a fairy tale promise of forever. It ends with a beginning, honest and hard one. Emily and Leo's story is a cautionary tale about the slow, insidious death of neglect, and the painful, complicated birth of something real. It's about how infidelity often isn't a sudden betrayal, but the tragic, final symptom of a love that has already ceased to breathe. And sometimes, it's about the devastating choice to walk away from a beautiful, empty shell, towards a messy, uncertain, but deeply felt reality, a reality where someone remembers not just your drink, but the very essence of who you are. Author's note: this story explores complex themes of loneliness, emotional neglect, and the difficult choices people face in relationships. It is not an endorsement of infidelity, but a portrayal of one woman's journey through a deeply painful situation. Every relationship faces